Morning and welcome to Portsmouth Point. Today we're going to talk about, there's a lot of discussion about the EU, especially as it's in less than a week's time, the referendum. But now we're going to talk about the implications for the rest of the world of Brexit, because truly we are a bit of an internationalist society, and if we look at the things if you're sort of a swing voter, you're looking at why, you're a bit confused, you're a bit conflicted with the arguments. How it's going to affect the rest of the world is another important argument, and if you look at it, how it's going to affect the world is also going to impact on Britain as well. So, what do you want to start with? The economy?
I think one of the big ones that everyone's been talking about is the economy, because it's going to have such a big impact. Because we give so much into Brussels with the EU, and we only get about 50% of that back, but in turn that helps other smaller countries.
Yeah, well, I think that if you look at things like the Chinese Shanghai Stock Exchange breakdown during last summer, you're looking at increasing volatility on the global markets, and Brexit in turn could further, for China maybe not, but for Europe it could further destabilise it. And if we're looking at, Britain, if we leave, we might be able to still trade with them, but if we've damaged them economically as well as us, that's not going to help us, because then we're going to have even less exports because they want to buy our products less. The economy is quite a open issue.
I think the thing is with the EU, a lot of people are saying that the economic fall of the euro is going to happen anyway.
Well, you look at Greece, you look at France.
If we remain, we're going to go with it. If we leave, we're going to quicken the process, but we're not going to be affected as much.
Well, a bit like natural selection or something.
But you've also got to look at the UK economy itself, because that's what people are looking at in this referendum, inwardly more so. So I think there's been statistics thrown around, as there always has been in this, but the fact that there will kind of be another recession, prices will go up, and yes, that's something in the short term. People are saying, oh, well, this will benefit us in the long term, but again, that's that.
But it's the long term that matters.
Of course.
If it's bad in the short term, good in the short term, and it completely ruins us in the long term, what's the point?
I think that's one of the important points, that the European Union is basically like a friendship, and we're going through a bad time at the moment.
But quite a controlling friendship.
But do you keep on and maintain that friendship, or do you break away? And the point is, I think, if you look at it, we've gained a lot from the EU. Look at how much of our exports is with the EU. That's not going to be a temporary or short-term loss. And
we're not going to lose all of our exports to the EU just because we've left the EU.
No, but it's
just going to cost us slightly more.
It's around 50%.
We can get around it.
It's around 50%, which is pretty massive.
We're not going to lose. We may not even lose much of that at all.
In the short term, we probably would.
Yeah, but in the long term, the point is, in the long term, that's what matters. It's not about the short term. But anyone can guess what the short term is. It's the long term that is the sort of scary thing that people are scared of.
So no one can guarantee what will happen.
No one can guarantee what happens.
That's what everyone's kind of scared of.
I think a lot of people are saying that the EU is collapsing, and if the EU does collapse, although we're not in the eurozone, then we will feel it, and it will damage our economy.
If we can get our recession out of the way.
Yeah, if we get our recession out of the way, we can start climbing again that economic ladder while the EU falls past us. And
what I'd say to that is that just because we're outside the EU isn't going to mean we're outside Europe. We're still going to be impacted on it. If you're talking about, our exports, they might recover with the EU once we get a trade deal or something. If they've got slower economic growth rates, which is going to be one of the impacts. So if you have smaller, states which are it's less free trade, stuff like that, there's less incentive to trade between each other, and that decreases, how much wealth Europe has, and that's the thing we benefit of. However much we talk about it, we can't put ourselves next to the US or Canada or somewhere. We're stuck here. We have to, look at the geographical position we are in the world, and also the nature of the world. We can't just go trading with somewhere like Nigeria or China, because they simply don't have the demand for the services that we provide, like financial services. They're still relatively not developed countries. So if you're talking about it, it's not going to help it. Like they're in the long term, in 100 years, yeah, Africa might well be the place to be, but at the moment, no.
I'd say also, in addition to that, so many businesses trade with the EU, UK businesses trade with the EU, and there's hundreds and hundreds of jobs that are related to the EU. So I think what some people are also worried about is their jobs could be put at risk if we leave the EU.
If we do leave the EU, it could open up a more global market, because at the moment we're slightly more limited to being within the EU.
Yeah,
if we leave the EU, we'll be able to make deals such as join the World Trade Union
I think that's
to
a
open it up.
good point, because I think you're forgetting we're not living in the medieval era here. This is modern era. It takes, 8 hours to go to America by flight. We can't trade with these other countries. It just takes slightly longer. And if we learn how to do that now, then it doesn't matter if it takes slightly longer. We can build our economy around that. There will always be problems in any economy, and there will always be ways around that. It's just how long are those ways? And I think if Europe collapses while we're still in it, those ways are going to be pretty long.
Yeah. Well, I think we've sort of gone over that issue. We've got quite different views. So shall we talk now about like national security and stuff?
Yeah,
because that's quite on the news with things like Paris, whether it's going to happen again in the Euros, terrorism. But first, we could talk about sort of nation states, sort of conflicting. So we've got quite a conflict between Putin and the European Union in Ukraine in terms of like positions. The European Union isn't involved in Ukraine. But there is an argument that if we allow the European Union to collapse, that's going to allow Putin to sort of create a revival of the Soviet Union, use sort of the way that we're sort of breaking up our economic friendships or breaking up, that it's going to allow him to exploit that. And especially with NATO, that America is now increasingly pivoting towards Asia and China. It's not caring so much about, for all the talk about, Ukraine, there's nothing really solid about it.
But the thing is, the European Union is not a military alliance.
Actually, there has been talk of making a large sort of
European
joint,
army.
yeah.
And also,
But that would also undermine NATO.
But the
So
EU,
it'd be unsafe.
That's the point. The EU, people are saying, biggest point about security, people are all saying for leave is the fact that EU isn't to do with security. Sure, there's some security aspects of it, and we can work together, but the EU isn't our security alliance. That is NATO.
Well,
And if you want to start a debate with NATO about NATO, then go ahead. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the EU, and that's not what the EU is about. The EU is an economic alliance, and NATO is a security alliance.
I think the important thing to look at is, if you look at conflicts, like, for example, the Second World War, the First World War, they were all to do with a lack of cooperation within Europe. And the Second World War especially was caused by economic downturn.
But
the Great Depression was the biggest recession at the time that had ever happened. So if you look at it, the Nazi Party, for example, had a few, 10,000 members or something before the Wall Street crash in 1929. It had like millions within 3 years. Now, it can't be, such a massive event. It's no coincidence, and it's widely accepted that economic causes were the result of, were the cause of extremism within Europe. And if you look at it, we've also got extremism coming up in Europe. So, for example, we know in Austria they nearly voted in a far-right chancellor and stuff, or president. So the threat of extremism in Europe is very real, and if we go back to the nationalism sort of way that we were before, conflict is very real. And although it's been like 70 years since the Second World War, for all I talk about, we're such a civilized society, there was the same talk in the 1900s, and I don't think really that much has changed. We're still getting the petty fights between Russia and the US.
But that's where there's one undemocratic country against a democratic country. As a history teacher in this school keeps saying, there has never been a war between two fully democratic countries. So
I'd say the EU links in with that point though, because if we all cooperate as we're in this union, this group of people. We have access to things kind of like the European arrest warrant, which has brought over 10,000 or thousands criminals back to Britain, and we've sent thousands back to their country so they can face justice. So by cooperating, we are putting
However,
an end to
it's
this.
the free movement of people, because you can't
Yeah,
trace terrorists.
I think that's going
between
on to
countries.
terrorism. So if we just quickly finish with national security, that part of the military aspect, I think it is quite clear, you know, Putin would like if we broke it up. And I think that's it's friendship, and, you know, that's going to make us, you know, Eastern Europe especially more vulnerable. And however much we talk about, oh yeah, you know, Brexit might be better.
I think.
Well, it's a status quo, and the status quo, to be perfectly honest, in military and, you know, looking at how Europe has developed, is pretty good. Like, yeah, we messed up in Ukraine, but the rest of the Baltic states are still free. They're probably as good as they've been in a few hundred years.
But then would we still not have to just rely on mutually assured destruction? If we left the EU, the effects would be economic. Secondary effect could be on the security, but we would still have a lot of ties. The military, yes, it'd be affected, but we still have a lot of ties as well with the USA. So we work with a lot of countries, such as Pakistan, which is over in that part of the world, and Bahrain. We have a number of different people who work very closely.
I think what people in the Remain are forgetting is that, you know, just because we've left the EU doesn't mean that, you know, we cannot, you know, we can have we can't cooperate with the EU at all.
Yeah.
I think what a lot of people in the Remain are suggesting is that if we leave the EU, you know, we can't even say hello to each other, but we can still work together. Just because we've left the EU doesn't mean we're not allowed to work with each other. It just means it could be a bit harder. And, you know, it's not as if these countries don't want to work with us,
We work with
because we've left the EU. They want to work with us, and, you know, we want to work with them. And just because we've left the EU doesn't mean that's not going to happen. It can happen, and if it need be, it will happen.
Would you not say being the EU strengthens our relationship with other countries, though?
Well, yes, but, you know, it's...
And that's
But then we
that's
can
the,
build
and
those
relations
relationships.
are the cause of
Yeah.
conflict.
And
And if we have less economic mutual interests, that's going to damage our relations potentially.
But if we
However,
leave them, we
it-
can rebuild that, and then we can make sure it's stronger while also then not having the
Yeah,
political
but how are you going to
decisions made
rebuild
by
it
them.
if you don't have the same organisation?
I
You
think-
know, if you look at NATO, yeah, of course we all hate Putin, but the point is, some of us are going to be less inclined and more inclined towards, you know, and political parties changing in power in Europe. Economics is basically the reason that those change, that extremism happens, and that's going to create less unity within Europe. So I think we'll go on to the next, terrorism. I think, to be honest, I'd say that, you know, it's quite conflicted. Do you want to talk about it from the Brexit perspective in Europe?
Well, like I said before, Europe doesn't want a terrorist attack just because we've left. Europe will work with us to help us, and we will help them. They're still going to happen.
Well, I think nobody wants a terrorist attack.
Yeah,
but,
that's my point.
But I think if we have, you know, if we're more like a separate nation state, we're not sort of working to it, there's less unity in Europe, we're going to be looking towards, you know, sort of not sharing as much intelligence.
which strengthens
that
our
is
But the
part of the
intelligence
European
hasn't
Union.
been as effective as it could have been, so we need to find a way at least to be able to change that intelligence sharing network.
Yeah, but I think it's clear that if you decrease your intelligence, that's not going to help your intelligence. So it isn't really, it's like saying, well, it could get better, but, you know, so why should we keep this, even if it's a good thing? Well, that's the point, it's
the
a good
thing is,
thing.
we can change it even if we leave. Interpol has a number, and also Europol already has a framework for setting up operational level agreements with non-EU countries, and they've done it before for intelligence sharing, for international operations, for helping each other with terrorism and security threats.
I think if you look at it from a real world perspective, you see that actually it's relations between states, and that's going to be, in my view, inevitably damaged by us leaving the EU. It's like saying, well, we actually hate your club, so bye-bye, we're rejecting you. So, and yes, there is points, you know, like freedom of movement. I accept that. One of the Brussels terrorists had actually come to Britain, and there is a chance of that. So I think that's sort of less clear cut. But if you look at the experts, I think it was like the previous MI5 and MI6 head both said they thought that we should stay in the EU because it helped our intelligence gathering.
But then there are a number of senior military officers who have all said, and they've actually made a group to say Brexit.
I think
So
that
it's
that's
very
one,
much
that's
a
one
divide
group.
through
That's
the
like
military.
that's like Brexit having like 300 businesses backing Brexit. That isn't. There are
There's a
200,000 companies which export to the EU. So it's completely just because a few military officers, and they're not even in.
Well, just because
they're
two
not part of.
MI6 former heads, you know, you're
The
kind
same
of
argument can be used
they're-
both ways.
yeah,
the
you're kind of
intelligence
contradicting
services.
yourself here.
Well, not really,
Not
because
really.
the military aren't in charge of intelligence gathering, are they?
But the military
Well,
are
it's
in charge of
military
operations.
intelligence.
Military.
It's different
yeah,
from military.
yeah,
Kind
I
of
know,
Secret
but
service.
they're not completely separate. They work together.
Okay.
That's the way it works.
Let's be clear. They don't work in intelligence gathering. They're in charge of the army, which is a completely different matter.
It's not
for
completely
intelligence.
different
Well, it is,
matter.
because
They're
they're not
both in charge of the same thing. They're both in charge of the security of our country. We're not worried about. This isn't. You've gone too deep into this. This isn't about intelligence or this or that. This is about the security of our country.
Yeah, I think if
But that's
you,
linked in
this is a
intelligence, isn't it?
specific
Yeah, I know
point,
it's
and
linked in, but so is the military.
does the head of the army work on intelligence gathering about terrorists?
Well, no, but does the head
No.
of MI6
Do
go
that,
out there and
yes.
stop terrorists?
No, but they're
Exactly.
No, but the point is
You
that
you can use arguments that you're saying for both
well,
sides.
if we know
Do
the
you
terrorists, then we'll go and get out and get them. It's not about it's really it's going to be impossible to take out these terrorists in our country. It's a rather practical, and I'm not saying easy. It's a complex situation, but us leaving the EU isn't going to, or if we stay, that isn't going to change how good our armed forces are in dealing with these threats in terms of how it happens in operation. But in terms of actually finding the terrorists, that's the point I'm talking about, which is about MI5 and MI6. They're in charge of that, and it's about locating the terrorists. That's the core point. It's not going to, it's not to do with, oh yes, we've got the EU flag on our shields when we're battering down terrorists and stuff. That's going to make a difference. It's about that as we're in the EU, we're cooperating, we're sharing intelligence, we're doing stuff, which means that we're more effective in finding terrorists. So, for example, you find common connections between cells.
I think all these different problems link into two things, Brexit or Remain, and those two problems link into one thing, and that is the fact that the EU is collapsing. It's collapsing at the moment, and if it does collapse, then what you're saying becomes completely, irrelevant. The EU has collapsed, and it has stopped working.
Well, I think I've made the point.
If we leave, then we will, perhaps our economy will go down. I think our economy will go down.
No, there'll be cuts.
It will.
Yeah,
There'll be another
well,
recession.
let's not go too far into that. It's all about how far we fall. And if we keep our fall, not that far, if that makes sense, we can get back up again while the EU fall, and we can be there to help the EU. We can be there in a better standard to help the EU if our economy is doing way better than it is doing now. And we can do that if we get out of the EU.
I think the point is that isolationism never works. It never solves problems. If you look at the
Well,
UN.
who says it's isolationism?
Well, it effectively is. If you're saying, well, we're going to get away from the EU and we're going to become less dependent
I've said
that
this
is
before. We're not
isolationism.
saying we're not going to cooperate with the EU. We're not going to cooperate with anyone. We're just saying we don't want to follow the EU's rules and regulations that are dictated by an unelected
Okay.
person.
I'd say we should probably
I
start
think,
to wrap
yeah,
this up, 'cause
we're
we're going round in
run-
circles here, and it's not
Yeah,
really,
I think
really helping. We've been
we
I
should
think
probably
just in the long term, in my opinion, I think much as leaving the EU would damage relationships, potentially shorter term with the EU, it could actually strengthen worldwide relationships because the EU can be slightly isolationist as a union itself and then leave out numerous other countries.
yeah.
So it could, in theory, help.
I think before anyone argues with that, I think we should just leave it there
Okay.
and say
Thanks for
vote
watching.
leave.
Thank you very much.
Vote
Vote
Remain.
leave.
Thank you
Vote
very
leave.
much. Leave.